I remember where I was when I first heard the news that Harvey Weinstein was being investigated for sexual abuse charges. I was on the East Coast. I was visiting a friend in Philadelphia, and I remember it so well. I didn't know who he was, actually, but I remember thinking that a person of this kind of stature, it was surprising to me that he'd let the scandal get to this point already. How did this happen? I remember it also so well because we were at a movie that night, my friend and I, and this delightful Jewish woman started a conversation with us in line about how she was telling us she had on very good authority that Harvey Weinstein was being framed by anti-Semites in Hollywood, which I felt like was probably as good of a possibility as any. At the end of the day, I figured we'd never really know what had happened. And regardless, most likely this would go away in a day or two anyway. And as people with this kind of power and money and ability to make or break the careers of lots of people have ways of making this go away. But then something really surprising happened. It didn't go away. In fact, it seemed like every day another woman came forward to share that her story of having been abused by Harvey. And then other women started coming forward, and men sharing about how they had been abused by other people as well. And then someone came up with a hashtag, MeToo, and then all of a sudden something shifted in my brain. And I felt like I tangibly remember the shift that happened that reminded me that I was free and that I wasn't alone, and that all of a sudden around the world there were people who could relate and who were validating my experience. As journalist Annelie Duva on Swedish radio said, Me Too was not a disclosure, but a confirmation of what women already knew. And I, for the first time, had hope that I might not have to settle for injustice. But after that hope sat for a bit, I also remember the very surreal realization that the entertainment industry and politicians around the world were actually far ahead of the church in dealing with sexual predators in their midst. While Latin Americans had ni una más, European women were coming forward and powerful abusers were losing their jobs in the US, the church remained strangely silent about its own ugly abuse secrets. The church seemed content to divert attention to the sinfulness of the world. All this is very surprising and unsettling to us as victims because we're talking about the church. We're talking about a place that holds sexual purity as a core value, that it should be a place for refuge for the marginalized and a voice for the voiceless. And yet we are continuing to be silenced. Why? I know what some of you are thinking, Kelly, wait just a minute. I am so sorry you were wounded, but you're getting a little witch hunty right now and perhaps overreacting just a bit. Because I know that these things happen and people are out there that are really bad. But this is really bordering on man-bashing right here. We're headed in a really dangerous territory. And if there were abusers in our midst and people were doing something bad, I would totally stand up and defend against that. And I believe that you would. But actually, it's a lot more difficult than you think. I have traveled this journey on my own, and I have traveled it with countless other women. And it gets really, really complicated. Consider this. If today I shared that I was being sexually abused by someone at Communitas, and let me state unequivocally that I am not, but let's say that I was, and let's say it's someone that you knew, someone who'd been in the organization for a long time, maybe. Someone who had a family, who had a ministry that was going forward. Someone who was a family man, who was likable, engaging. You would have a difficult decision to make. You'd be conflicted. On one hand, I also am part of this community, and I am a good person as far as you know. I'm likable, extremely likable. But, and there are a lot of buts. But maybe you're just overreacting or you misunderstood. But he's done so much good. One mistake and you're going to destroy his entire ministry? But what about the damage to non-believers and new Christians if this kind of stuff gets out about the church? But what about forgiveness? So you see, it's not quite so easy as it seems, which is one of the reasons I believe we are continuing to silence victims, because it means standing up against our own community. And that feels disloyal at best, sinful at worst. It's much easier to focus on the sin out there than the sin within our own walls or even in our own hearts. It's cost deeply to address this issue. We have often believed that our enemy is somewhere out there, and to consider what's going on inside our own walls is so overwhelming that it's much easier to brush it under the rug. But many of us, particularly women, know that the church is not long going to be able to keep this under wraps. Bob Chavidian, who is actually the grandson of Billy Graham and is a director of an organization that investigates abuse claims in Christian environments. He's been saying for about 5 years now that the evangelical church has a bigger scandal on its hands than the Catholic Church when it comes to sexual abuse. And in worse news for Communitas, he says that mission organizations are magnets for would-be abusers. Rachel Den Hollander grew up in a small Midwestern church. As a young girl, she was being molested by a college-age man in the church. Fortunately, her parents had a friend who was a counselor and recognized some of the signs of the predatory behavior, told her parents, and Rachel was able to say that she felt very uncomfortable around that man. There was more going on, but she was too young and didn't have the words to describe it. So the abuse stopped, at least from the original predator. And what happened after that, though, was that the church began to be a very unsafe place for them. In their small group, they accused them of overreacting. Kids were no longer allowed to play with Rachel because she could not be relied on to tell the truth. And Rachel learned very early on in her life that if you have been abused and you come forward, you will not be believed. And it hurts not just you, but it hurts the people you love too. So she made a commitment to never say anything out loud about that. And she kept that promise when at age 15, she went to her team doctor and she was very uncomfortable with the way he was touching her. But she made a commitment to say nothing. She moved on, got married, went to college, became a lawyer, had kids. And then 17 years later, something happened. She was sitting down at the breakfast table and read an article that Dr. Larry Nassar was being investigated on sexual abuse charges. He was the USA gymnastics team doctor, had been at Michigan State before that. And she knew that her time had come. That morning, she called her lawyer, drafted a statement, and contacted the Indy Star, the newspaper, and said, I will be the first to put my name in. I will publicly state that I was sexually abused by Dr. Larry Nassar. In the statements, that started the entire process where later at Larry's trial, over 150 women gave personal testimonies to the abuse that Larry Nassar had perpetrated against them while they were under his care. Rachel Den Hollander was the last to give her testimony. It changed the world. Ironically, while all this was going on in the marketplace, though, she and her husband were attending a church that was involved in reinstating a pastor by the name of C.J. Mahaney to ministry. You probably don't know who he is. You may. He was the head of Sovereign Grace Ministries in the U.S. He was accused of covering up multiple incidences of child sexual abuse that took place at his church. At his trial, it was dismissed on a technicality. He never acknowledged any wrongdoing, even though staff members of his were convicted of child molestation. When Rachel and her husband went to the staff of their church as they began to reinstate CJ and just shared their own story and asked to discuss what this message might be sending to both victims and enablers of predators, they were told that they should probably find another church. And this is one of the reasons that a second reason we are often kept silent is because abusers are often successful and charismatic. Predators aren't lonely, creepy guys. They can be successful leaders, church planters, family men. They're attractive, they appear earnest, and it's very difficult for us to believe that people who do good can also be doing very bad things. My abuser was building a very successful college ministry on one of the largest campuses in the US, while simultaneously preying on college women in that same group. Personally, he pushed me to get treatment for an eating disorder that saved my life and set my life on a whole new trajectory. I am forever grateful. And he is still a sexual predator. When he was quietly asked to leave the group and go to another church because numerous women came forward and shared what was happening in the counseling sessions he was having with them, he went on to another church and was again very successful. And he never stopped being a predator. It makes us as victims question ourselves, and it creates enough confusion inside of an organization that we become paralyzed and do nothing. And often, if the victim continues to speak when no one's willing to listen, it's likely he or she will become demonized in order to get back to that emotional equilibrium and spiritual certitude that we so crave. It messes with all of us when we have to ask, like a former colleague of Bill Hybels, how could he have done all this good when there were such dark things happening behind the scenes? And that's another reason, number 3, that victims are often silenced in the church. Gender inequality. Now let me be very clear about this. Men are not the problem. In fact, I wouldn't even venture to bring this up in a gathering like this, and if you're a man in this conference and you don't know me yet, this is your first time, I'm sorry. You can ask around. I have the highest respect for the men in this organization. I have worked closely with many of you, and all of you who I know would not actually be defending yourselves. You would be the first to say, I want to be part of the solution. I am honored to work with you. Men are not the problem. Living in a society that was created by men and for men is the problem. In a lopsided world, our voices are often not heard. And often not out of maliciousness, just out of an unawareness of what is happening in the process. Just because you don't mean harm, unfortunately, doesn't mean there isn't harm. We all know that to be true. Many times, no matter who you are, you've experienced examples of that. But in the church, our attitudes and practices towards sex and gender relationships have been almost singularly formed by men. The belief that women are temptresses and men are slaves to their sex drives, that women are responsible for male behavior because we're always at risk for leading a man on or causing him to stumble, is still very much in the vernacular and in our minds. In the US, 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual assault. In Europe, it's 1 in 3. In the cities of Latin America, half of all women have been a victim of sexual assault. Women are not causing this to happen. Sexual temptation is real, and we must be vigilant to protect our purity. But this isn't a talk about sexual temptation, it's about abuse, and there is a big difference. Sexual abuse is more about power than sex, and a predator knows how to exploit the system. And well-intentioned men can end up creating boundaries that unintentionally keep us as being viewed as objects and keep us out of our God-given roles in the church. When some men hear what's happening in the U.S. at Willow Creek and Bill Hybels, they will be tempted to put more protections in place to keep further distance between men and women in church roles. But none of that will work to stop a predator. What stops a predator is listening to women and taking appropriate action. What is needed is more women in ministry, not less. More willingness to deal with the tensions of mixed gender interactions. We will not make progress against predators in our midst without women participating in and leading conversations about sexual predators and enablers in church. When women are silenced, we continue to be victimized, and men remain less than who God intended them to be. And together we become trapped in an unhealthy cycle of relating, growing ever and ever more mistrustful of each other. And the last reason I believe that we continue to be silenced is a poor theology of forgiveness and peace. I wish I could end this talk with inspiring stories of how churches are handling abuse allegations well in their midst, but I don't know any. That's not to say they don't exist, but if they do, they are the exception. Rachel Den Hollander, who I mentioned earlier, says it better. She says, "It is with deep regret that I say the church is one of the worst places to go for help. That's a hard thing to say," she says, "because I am a very conservative evangelical. But that is the truth. There are very, very few who have ever found true help in the church." In her victim statement, she stated that she did forgive Larry Nassar. She was hesitant to even say that for the reason that, and what she knew would be true, is that Christian organizations all picked up on the forgiveness aspect of it. We love that. But what they didn't ever mention is that she also called for swiftly taking care of God's judgment. She called for justice and repentance. Both of these are biblical concepts, she says. Both of those represent Christ. We do not do well when we focus on only one of them. And then there's peace. Jeremiah 6:14, God is talking to the people of Israel, and he's telling Jeremiah about abominations in their midst. And what he says is, "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace," they say, when there is no peace. Peace is not safeguarding the church's image at the expense of victims. It's not squelching conflict. Peacemaking is some of the most difficult work we can do. It means facing into conflict. It takes time, perseverance, and often a third party to facilitate. But let me suggest two practical ways to begin the hard work of true peacemaking in this endeavor. It requires a willingness to do your own emotional work, to wrestle with strong reactions and confusing emotions. If we're to make real progress, none of us can be silenced. If you disagree with everything I've said today, or you just feel agitated and annoyed right now and you're not even sure why, we have to be able to have safe, honest conversations in order to truly move forward. We're all carrying a great burden. And a topic like this has the potential to put all of our coping mechanisms on high alert. What a gift if we could create spaces for that in our communities. One way to do that is simply listen to the viewpoint of another, maybe someone who thinks differently than you do, even on this topic. Listen without defending or arguing. Be curious about their story. Thank them for sharing and receive it as a gift. As you may have noticed, this is not a talk with a formula for change. It is an invitation to a new discussion, to just begin breaking the silence. One of the gifts of being an abuse victim is how the pain has pushed me to grow in ways I never would have pursued otherwise. As I've faced into the ugliness of others, I have had to look in the mirror and face into my own ugliness. I have found that I am stronger than I knew and more fragile. And I've discovered compassion for others and for myself that has drawn me deeper and deeper into God's love. In our own missional guidebook, we talk about embedding by asking the question, what is good news to the people around us? Good news to an abuse victim is a safe place, a place where both love and justice exist, a place where predators are not enabled, where victims are not silenced, where courageous people are willing to address injustice within, not just out there. I believe you want that too. But we can't give what we don't possess. So we still need to start practicing these principles right now in order to truly embody them. In the days ahead, I hope we will have more intentional conversations about this, what this means for us as an organization and for each of us in our communities. Most of all, I pray that we would not bandage the wounds of God's children lightly, that we would not say peace when there is no peace. May God grant us grace as we seek to live out his kingdom through his church. Thank you.